recording. Interactions sometimes change the way a community is structured. And one kind of species in a community of species is known as keystone species. And a keystone species determines the composition of other species in the neighborhood. Of other species in the community. And we'll look at sea stars a little bit later, and we'll also look at otters. So species diversity includes two things. It includes, at least this is the way ecologists talk about it, richness, which is the total number of different species. But relative abundance is part of it as well. So species richness is the number of different species. Relative abundance is the proportion of each species represented in the community. So here are two different communities. They all consist of trees. They have the same number of species, so A, B, C, and D, but in community one, they're evenly dispersed and relatively even numbers. Whereas in the other community, community two, they are not evenly dispersed. So some are rare. And you know, it's a bit of a kind of a jargony sort of thing, that the way ecologists talk about a community. Usually, if you say there's a lot of diversity, this community would be considered more diverse. And the one that has just a few very rare species would not be considered as diverse. So a community with even species abundance is more diverse, according to this definition, than one in which one or more species are abundant and the remainder rare. So in a community, there's generally a trophic structure. Trophic means feeding. Feeding relationships between organisms. And that's a key factor in community dynamics. Who eats who and who competes with who for what? So here is a food chain showing trophic structure. So in a food chain or a food web, you always draw the arrow from what is eaten to what eats it. So that's the direction of the arrow. So here we have a marine food chain on one side and a terrestrial food chain on the other side. So the primary producers are at the bottom of the food chain, and they use sunlight for photosynthesis. And are autotrophs. They make their own food. They're bottom of the food chain generally, and in a marine system, it would be the various phytoplankton that we looked at. And in a terrestrial system, it would be the plants are the primary producers. The next level is a primary consumer. They eat the plants. Zooplankton in a marine environment, herbivores in a terrestrial environment. Secondary consumers eat the primary consumers. They're both carnivores in a terrestrial and a marine system. Tertiary consumers are carnivores that eat higher up on the food chain, and a quaternary consumer is the top of the food chain, and also carnivores. So that is a food chain. This is a very broad food chain. It's more like going from one level to another, not necessarily distinguishing exact species, but um, if we were to make it a real chain, we'd have to give the name of the species of this phytoplankton if there was an individual species of phytoplankton. So let's look at a web. A web is different than a chain. It's a branching chain with very complex interactions. So here you have phytoplankton. It's eaten by krill, a euphosid, but also by copepods. We're going to be looking at copepods in the lab. Not next. No, yeah, next week on the 15th. Yeah, we'll look at copepods. Copepods may be one of your study animals for your project. Copepods are eaten by different kinds of plankton, but also by fishes and also by squid. So you can see that it's a complex arrangement. It's not just from one thing to another in a chain. But you can make a chain out of a web if you choose certain organisms. So in this case, from the zooplankton, we go from the zooplankton to fish larvae and fish larvae to a striped bass, that's a chain. If we were to go from the zooplankton to the fish larvae to a sea nettle, that's another chain. So food webs can be simplified into chains. And this is a more simple food web altogether. There's limits though. You don't see food chains that have over the quaternary consumer level. You just don't find them very often in nature at all. So each food chain in a food web is usually only a few links long, not very long. And there's two hypotheses that attempt to explain this food chain length. One is known as the energetic hypothesis. So the food chain length is limited by an inefficiency of energy transfer from one level to the next. That's one hypothesis. The other hypothesis is that a long food chain is less stable than the short food chain, so the populations are likely to be less stable. But really, the energetic hypothesis is the best one. So in this case, we have a number of species, a number of trophic links. So the x-axis is productivity. So that means how fast growth is and how productive an environment is. So the number of species are here around 3.5, and the number of trophic links are quite long. If you have a lower number of trophic links, you have relatively more species, and with the lowest number of trophic links, then you have a lower number of species. Another concept in community is a dominant species. So a dominant species is the one that's most abundant or has the highest biomass and generally has a powerful control over the presence and distribution of other species. A keystone species are not necessarily abundant, but they do have a strong control. They're either the most competitive or they're very good at avoiding predation. I'll give you these two examples. One is sea stars. So sea stars feed preferentially on mussels. They feed on mussels. They will consume other invertebrates, but mussels are their favorite food. So here is an example of an exclusion experiment. So in this case, the number of species present are here on the y-axis, and this is time. So in this case, at this time, 1963 or so, the sea stars were removed from one area, and another area remained the same. But with the sea star removed, the number of species dropped considerably. And that's because, so you say you have a rock, there's a rock, and you have a few mussels, but you also have barnacles, and you have limpets. This is not what limpets look like. And you have little tiny periwinkles and maybe some other kind of snail. So that there's quite a diversity of different species. And that's because the sea star eats the mussels to keep the mussel population down. So if you don't have a sea star on the same rock, the mussels, they outcompete all of the other organisms there, and you'll basically get mostly mussels. Does that make sense? Another case of keystone species are otters. So the sea otter, this is very interesting because this looks like a river otter, but it's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be a sea otter. And these are killer whales. So if there are a lot of killer whales, they will keep this sea otter population down because killer whales do eat sea otters. Sea otters like to eat sea urchins, and sea urchins eat seaweed. So when the killer whales prey on the otters, there are few otters, more sea urchins, and less seaweed. So it's an effect from the top down. This is called a top-down effect. If there are many otters in a community, they keep the urchin levels down, and there's usually quite a lot of seaweed. So that's another example of a keystone species. Another type is called a foundation species, and they exert their influence by causing some kind of physical change in the environment that affects the community. So they're facilitators. So for example, beaver dams. Beavers are facilitators because they build dams, and a dam causes flooding, essentially, causes lakes to increase in the volume of water, and that allows other animals to live in the water, amphibians, different insect larvae, and fishes. So before the beavers, there wasn't as much water in the lakes. So that's one example. Do I have any more? Yeah, here's another one. This is a salt marsh. So juncus is kind of a grass, and it has the capacity of enriching soil with nitrogen. So the number of species is greater when the juncus is there because the juncus enriches the soil. Without the juncus, there are fewer species. So the juncus has a positive effect on survival and reproduction of the other species. So control of a food chain or a food web can be from the bottom up. So that's influence from lower to higher trophic levels. It starts off at the bottom with nutrients. They're not the living part of the chain, but nutrients can affect the lowest level. So if, for example, plants don't get enough nitrogen or enough phosphate, then their numbers will decrease and the effect will be felt up the food chain. A top-down effect is control from the trophic level above. So predators, for example, control the number of herbivores. And this is So these both have issues associated with them with human intervention. So, for example, we have a tendency to hunt large predators like wolves, for example, and coyotes. And one of the reasons that humans hunt wolves and coyotes is because they're thought to eat our hunting animals, for wolves, deer, or our farm animals like sheep. But because we've hunted many wolves and coyotes, it means that the animals that they were keeping under control, the herbivores, have really completely changed ecosystems. So, and I'm going to show you a really good example of a reintroduction of wolves into an ecosystem. And I think, how are we doing for time? 5:35. I'm going to stop there because I would like you to do another exercise. So thank you for that.